Hi, I'm Megan Phillips from Sur Lemure, and I'm very honored to have two incredible ladies with me this evening for Girl Talk, sponsored by EP and LP Restaurant in West Hollywood. And we have Alexandra Grant, an incredible LA-based artist, and we have Ginna Christensen. And I'm just so honored to have these two ladies here. We're going to have a little girl talk and a little chat about what they're up to, and I'll hand the mic over now.
Thank you, Megan.
You're welcome.
Well, I'm really excited to be here today with one of my favorite people in the entire world to be having a conversation about art, publishing, and philanthropy, and also your journey in getting to all three places. So thank you, Megan, for having us. So I kind of want to start talking about your background and your childhood, because you have a really interesting upbringing. So can you talk to us a little bit about that and how that has informed maybe the work that you do?
Thank you, Ginna. Always starting with the easiest question first. So, I had the privilege of growing up in large part outside the United States. So I think that created a lot of interest for me in language, in culture, and how sometimes we have huge interior worlds that aren't represented in the world around us. And the importance of art, creativity, literature to keep the interior world alive in the new world. And that's probably the most important part of my background. I mean, I was so lucky. I grew up in Mexico City and in Paris and in Ohio. And Washington, D.C. I mean, I really was fortunate in that I got to move around a lot as a kid and get to know a lot of different places and different industries, and because of my mother's work, and a huge part of my upbringing also is that I had a very strong mother, and I think a big role model in terms of what was possible. And my dad was a geologist, so he had a very different sense of time and urgency than most people. So everything was in the hundreds of thousands of years. But he also came from Scotland. So again, having parents who had very different backgrounds than my own was really important to the way that I saw the world. And I think also helped me develop a really strong sense of empathy. That sense of, wow, if this is how I feel, imagine what's going on inside of another person, because of all the moving and just the cultural differences.
Well, I mean, you're just making me think about what have been in my own life the most learning experiences, and they've always come from travel. But I didn't start traveling overseas until I was an adult. So to have that at such a young age, I'm sure, I just wonder if you look at it that way, and how has travel and sort of being a maybe foreigner in your hometown, how has that affected your work, do you think?
I love that question because it's about 5 questions. So everyone is here. Now you're here for a much longer period of time. So the first image that came to mind is when I grew up in Mexico in the 70s and early 80s, it was like the coolest graphic design. Like, people were really into triangles. And I just remember, my name is Alexandra, middle initial A, Grant, and I was obsessed with my first passport of getting my signature right, because I knew that I had to have like a cool, so I had 3 triangles, the A, and the G. I have no idea why I'm telling you this in response to that question, but I was like very aware of like needing to have this like the relationship between graphic identity and name and being female and the passport. Now, what was the rest of the question?
Well, I think you just answered it. I mean, the question was really about how did, almost being a foreigner in your hometown, how did that affect, your learning experience? So I think you answered part of that in terms of saying what, the scene was in Mexico, but please add on to that.
Why not? I will. Okay. I in growing up in Mexico City, for people who grew up there, you always say, what school did you go to? Not what university, but it's people identify by what grade school. And when I was a kid, there were 2 British schools. One was called Green Gates. I suppose the gates were green. And I went to Edron, which was founded by Edward and Ronald. Hence, it's called Edron, but it's in Spanish, Edron. Edron. So yo fui al Edron. And what I loved about Edron is that we sang the Beatles a lot of When I'm 64, which is unimaginable when you're 7. But now I'm like, oh God, it's creeping up. But it's that thing about bringing so many different cultures together. So at the Edron, my best friends were the daughter of the Ethiopian ambassador, a woman. A young girl from Guernsey whose mother had photographed the Beatles, the granddaughter of one of the Mexican presidents. Like, it was this remarkable group of young girls who came from every walk of life and exposed me to that. And I grew up in a neighborhood where we were within walking distance of the Frida Kahlo house. So again, being exposed to things that now are so popular in American culture, but when I first moved back to the United States, I knew all of the Mexican states, but I didn't know where any of the American states were the capitals, So it's been so interesting to see as American culture has become more Latin or more Hispanic to have that knowledge of the place. And so, I'm very grateful to being an Anglo-Mexican. That's the way I see it on the inside. Although very few people identify me as a Spanish speaker in the United States, which is okay. I think every place, again, I think that's why context and understanding how people's judgment of you varies according to context, and understanding how I judge people differently according to context. And I think that's why travel is so fundamental to an understanding. And for those of us who don't travel physically, we do it in our imaginations. And that is, I'm not answering, hi, Chris, in the middle of this. You found us, come join us. But I think that the idea of traveling in your imagination, it becomes such a vital political position, because I think that what artists and creative people are able to do, because sometimes travel becomes an issue of money and it becomes an issue of class. But imagination is free and creativity is infinite, and it's everyone's possibility. And I love how the idea of mental travel and the role artists play in creating portals for mental travel is the biggest, most democratic thing that I think anyone can participate in now. So I'm sorry if I'm jumping ahead in terms of your questions, but for me, there's such a real relationship between the dislocation of identity that comes from having moved and being part of different cultures to the metaphors that as an adult we can provide as artists and writers.
I love the way you just described art in that way, of being a portal for travel, because I've thought about it more in a way of being able to yank a person out of their, day-to-day typical to-do list. It's an opportunity to escape, but I never thought of it as travel. I love that description. Thank you for that. I now want to move to your creative process. So I know myself, I am a creative consultant. I work mostly in the design world, and I work a lot with brands and trying to help them to identify what their differentiating point is. But again, the process it's very organic. So when someone tries to say to me, what does your process look like? Well, it's very organic. So maybe you can tell us a little bit about what your process looks like and what inspires you.
Well, I love how we met. I think that's such a great story to just show a little snippet, which is that I had just done a fundraising image for Side Street Projects, a nonprofit in Pasadena that supports woodworking and all sorts of skills for young children in schools that don't have strong arts education. I guess it's not departments, it's strong arts education, full stop. And so I'd done an image to help them with their fundraiser, and you saw it online, and your brain went, this picture should be a rug. And I got this email out of the blue that was like, Alexandra, would you consider turning your fundraising image for Side Street Projects into a rug? And I thought, every time I open an email, I think, oh gosh, the Secret Santa, like what's coming now, And so I looked at it, and then you walked in and you were so enthusiastic, and your motivation and was very pure about wanting how to collaborate and what we were going to collaborate about and how we were going to make this thing. And then you modeled my image into a digital image of a rug, and I thought it could be a rug, and now it's a beautiful rug. And so I think part of the creative process is being open, like that for me, I'm very interested in the digital world and being a maker of things. Like I make a thing with my hands, and then I take a picture of it and put it on the internet, and then that becomes that movement back and forth. So the image we worked on was this hilarious photograph that I'd taken by putting my face inside a scanner. Right. So I was like, and it was high def, which I didn't understand how long it would take. And I just remember at the time, I just was lying down in the scanner, and it was like face down in the middle of the study. And it took 16 minutes to scan. And it was just like, this is the worst idea ever. Like face down scanning. So, and then that scan, I added paint to and text to on the computer. And then you made it into a rug digitally. And then we made it into, someone went in Nepal, knotted every single one of those pixels into a beautiful knot. I mean, it was like this thing. And so for me, it's that moment of when do you have an idea, it's a cerebral or emotional cerebral, and then suddenly when it becomes a haptic thing, when it becomes a real object, like what is that gesture in reality, and then going back and forth between like the thing in the reality and the thing in your imagination, and that dance. And my mother, so tying back to childhood, my mom found this thing I made when I was like 8 at the Edron. And we were supposed to make a newspaper article. And so I, of course, was like, cool, a newspaper article. My best friend at the time was like, Sophie, you're going to write 3 articles about this. And we're going to draw these drawings. And one was Hitler was found alive. I was 8. And I made a masthead, and we laid the whole newspaper out. I made my mom drive us to the only photocopier that had newsprint in Mexico City. And we literally handed in a newsprint fake newspaper that we'd made when we were 8. And every other kid in my class handed in a piece of notebook paper. And my teacher, this was my report card, was A++++, question mark, not sure what to do with you. And my mom was like, I think you've just been doing this. Like, so there's this sense too of, I think we're born a certain way. Like we're wired from birth in a certain way. I mean, it is the culture and it is that, all of that stuff for sure. But it's also that child. And I think as adults and adult artists, that part of my job isn't just the making, it's preserving the space to have what I would call a second innocence. Like I'm not trying to be a child as an adult, but just to replace the naivete with innocence, which is that, look at the light right now, right? Like we have this red behind us, we have this light blue. It's so beautiful. It's like a Cacharel ad from the 80s, it's like, what is it, and to really keep being in the present. And I think a lot of people, for many reasons, aren't able to do that. And so part of my process is really just tapping into this, what I would call symphonic vision of how to stay really connected to making in the now.
That just brought so many questions up for me. The first being, you spoke about this experience of making this newspaper at 8. When did you first have the idea that I'm going to be an artist? That is what I'm going to do for a living.
I love your questions. I I'm not sure if I did have it so specifically, clearly, like there's a point. It was, I went to college as a math major. Yeah, I was really into linear algebra. And, but there were like 3 dudes in my class my freshman year, and I thought, this isn't my cohort. These aren't the people I want to be with. And I also had this other thought, which was, I'm really smart, I'm really good at math, but I'm never going to be fluent at it. Like, we got to the 8th dimension, and people were like, blah, 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 at the 9th, and I was like, I don't know I had no idea. Like, I couldn't actually visualize, or I didn't have a grasp on. And I thought, I can't fake it. I'm 19 years old. I can't fake math. And then you start reading about these like crazy loner Russian dudes living with their mom and solving theorems. And you're like, that's really not the lifestyle I want to sign up. Because it's a life, this idea of building a life. So my search at that point became for a language that was authentic to me. And I did everything. Psych 1, Poli-Sci 1, Econ 1. I wrote a song. I got through it. Econ was tough. I was like, oh. Let's see. I did all the ones. And then I did do an art class. And it was really frustrating because I wanted to be logical about it. And I took a year off from college. And during that period of time, I took more art classes. And I realized that what was interesting to me about the field of art was that it could be anything. That it was welcoming to anyone, and that in my moving from place to place to place as a child, I was lucky in that I was always taken to art galleries and museums. So that I knew that even if you did, it's like you can always recognize a toilet internationally. Well, you can always recognize a museum. That it was a safe space, that it was a place that I was going to be welcome, and that it was a language that was beyond language. And it also seemed to be like the Wild West. That it didn't make sense. Like, why is there a urinal on display and it's worth so much to so many people and change the history of art? Like, and so suggested questions of also masculinity, again, I think I was interested as a younger person in power. Like, why is something important and who assigns that value? And that questioning came from growing up in Mexico, and again, like knowing who Frida Kahlo was when I was 7, and moving back to the United States, and people being like, taco? What's a taco? Like not knowing about Mexico. And I was like, okay. But seeing, again, like that the Jewish and World War II diaspora from Europe went all over Latin America, and I really understood that as a kid, so not understanding why certain things weren't in the United States when I came back to live here as a teenager. Did I do okay on the answer?
Yes.
Okay, good. I was like, not sure if I answered the question.
I want to go back to the story you were telling earlier about our first meeting.
Yes.
And the actual piece that we made the rug out of.
Yeah.
You mentioned there was text added to that piece, and the text was, if I remember correctly, I was born to love, not to hate. Just before we started the interview, we were talking about the Fred Rogers film and how his message was all about love.
Yeah.
You have the word love tattooed on your arm. You have your sculpture here in front of us with love. So I want to talk a little bit about love and how working with this message, because it seems to come up and continue to come up, in your work over and over again. How has that changed you? And how do you hope that it changes the viewer?
I know, I'm like, okay, you just dropped the mic to me. Thanks. So for me, the word love it's a bridge building word, because I think it's very personal. When I started my love work 10 years ago, there was a lot of condescension, a lot of people sort of patting me on the head, like, that's really nice female thing to do, love, you want to support other artists, that's great. I think the political climate is so different that the meaning of it is really shifted substantially. We've seen, for example, funding in the arts be so eroded that in fact I've had conversations with people who say that the greatest support of the arts in the future will be artists supporting. So it'll be like the Warhol foundations, and so it's just it really to me it's this sense of civic responsibility that we're all, even before I was an artist, I had a sense of we have to figure out how to give back. And that I understood what philanthropy was from a really young age. I think when you grow up in a culture that's not the United States, certainly right now, this isn't the case because there's so much visible poverty in America. I think the homelessness in LA alone. But as a child growing up and you see in Mexico City and you're seeing the incredible disparity of wealth between the richest and the poorest. And unfortunately, I see the United States has moved in that direction. It just was shocking to me as a little girl and who wanted to do something. So my mom would laugh because she was like, I gave you your allowance every week and you'd give it away. Like from the time I was, again, it's like these things are in us, I think. And you're on a street corner in busy Los Angeles. And the LAPD is making an appearance. So, as again, it's like one of the things in the real reason I got involved in starting the Grant Love Project is because I see the art world as becoming, it's a huge investment category. It's the third largest black market in the world after guns and drugs. Imagine you're trying to move $150 million from point A to point B. No better way than a painting. So the interests in the art world are completely nefarious. So I'm really interested in how this very fluid market can be used to address questions of betterment. That artists, and I hope young artists from here on, are going to be more focused on questions of environment instead of questions of the value of their work. Questions of, racial oppression and questions of how do we embrace, gender difference. I think these are the questions of the future, and I think it's for the creatives to really begin to address them. So I wanted, as a painter who makes basically, luxury items, that I wanted to address a way to be philanthropic, because my work, as you can tell, is I think about things a lot, and I really put a lot of thought into what I'm doing. I see my work in the studio really in relation to the history of painting, which again is a certain kind of relationship to a certain kind of audience. But I wanted to create like a prêt-à-porter line. Like that's my couture line. My prêt-à-porter line is the love. It's like figuring out how I can support through my creativity, different nonprofits, different projects, and contest what the word means. So my longest project, the project that we first founded and funded, is called the Love House in Watson. It's 10 years later, and we're finally in construction with it, and it's this dedication and commitment to people, through the concept of love, who come from very different backgrounds but shared similar values, which are ethical, which means showing up, and a kind of loyalty, and a belief that we are the same, despite all these differences in race, class, gender, that ultimately that there's a connection of the human spirit. And I see that everyone with creative dreams, that this sense gets eroded over time because people become practical, or they become cynical, or they see that the market goes that way. But, I think just by the nature of being female or female identified is that I'm part of the resistance. The lovely owner of Melissa of EP and LP, she told me tonight the statistics. At art school, 50% of the students are women. By the time they graduate, maybe 27% of the galleries are women. The shows in museums, the numbers are dismal. It's not, tell me an industry where you would do a graduate degree and look at and say, law firms, yeah, there's only 20% women, even though 50% of our law students, that's unheard of. The sexism, it's so ingrained in the arts. And so for me, love is also asking, well, why is this a bad idea in art, right? It's naked women bodies everywhere. Like, that's naturalized, but love is like poo-pooed. So how do we begin to talk about not just female presence, but the feminine presence in the arts, and really think about the values that we're communicating through creativity? I mean, I think about all the problems on the planet and how it seems like so many people are dedicated to making them worse, right? Like, really? Let's frack in California. I heard that one. It's like, yeah, in a place where we already have enough earthquakes. Like, what? It seems that to me that I'm a person who believes in being for things, like being for new ideas, and so holding the whatever it is, the flag, the staff, and saying, well, what would happen if we had more women, and sort of hoping to hold that space.
Love is the answer. I want to really talk a little bit more, if you don't mind, about the Love Project and really what your work looks like there. I mean, you have some pieces here tonight, I think, that are for purchase, and maybe you can let the people know here tonight, how exactly it works. Where does the money go? How do you decide? And I think it'd be interesting to hear a little more about the Love House as well. I know that's more than one question.
I'm getting used to your interview style, Ginna. So the Love Projects usually are in collaboration with an existing nonprofit, and we create editions. I read a book about Picasso many years ago where it was like he just knew he was minting money by drawing, and I thought there was a certain kind of barter power in that, right? So I feel like all the Love Projects for me are currency, and they're based on a trademark. It's a trademark symbol I have. It's everything has to be philanthropic for the arts, and so we can do clothing. We can do, we've done all sorts of stuff, rings, necklaces, and basically I partner. Fundraising is probably the most onerous task for every nonprofit, and this is just a way to connect and bring energy to an existing nonprofit. One of my favorite projects, which I think will give you a sense of the kind of connectivity that I'm excited about, is I worked with the Heart of Los Angeles, and we did beach towels, which were so cool. But in selling the beach towels, maybe we donated like $10,000. But at the party where we launched the beach towels, I was able to connect a friend whose charity ended up raising $250,000 for the Heart of Los Angeles. So I often say that the Love Project is more about friend raising than it is fundraising. So really about connecting people, getting different people from different walks of life in the same room, and often the female leaders who understand the validity of that. And so you wanted to know more about the Love House. The Love House is a project that we developed with a woman named Monique Johnson, who lives across the street from the Watts Towers. And it's to better her life. She identified 100% with my concept that she lived in the Love House. I didn't know. It's an intuitive proposal. And it is a place where everyone in her extended family is welcome, from her children to her mother and to her brother. Everyone stays there, and we really want to make it a public artwork that blends the boundary between the private and the public for the people who are visiting Watts to see the towers, but also afford her the freedom to extend hospitality. So I think ultimately that word hospitality is what the Love Project is about, which is about welcoming different people of different walks of life to a place of exchange.
That's a really beautiful thing.
Thank you.
Should we talk about books now?
I'd love to.
So you have a history of teaming up with writers in collaboration with a lot of your paintings, but you launched a book company last year called X Artists Books. Can you tell us a little bit about that journey, and have you experienced similar challenges within the publishing world as you have in the art world. So I'll get a little more specific. You spoke about just a little while ago, 50% of women, being students in graduate school for arts and only 27%, becoming artists. Do you feel that same sort of challenge as a woman in publishing? Sorry, start with X article.
Okay. These are I need to take notes before these questions happen, it's an amazing question. Thank you. So I hadn't intended to start X Artist Books. I wrote a book called The Artist Prison in 2013. It's kind of a Kafkaesque or Sartrean vision of the art world, but located in a prison, and examining the relationships of how different artists and players relate to each other in a very small ecosystem. And in writing the book, which came to me, I wanted to say out of nowhere, except I was teaching in Annecy in France at an art school, and when I gave a copy to the professor who invited me, she asked me, Alexandra, how did you channel the building? Because the building was a prison, the Annecy Art School, in World War II, where they tortured and killed resistance fighters. So the possibility that I might have had a really profound experience of the place. So, because again, I hadn't intended to write a book. So you asked about my creativity. How does it happen? Well, sometimes it's in Spanish we say relampagazo, which means like a giant thunderbolt. It just comes from nowhere. So I'd written this book. Eve Wood, who's a wonderful writer, and she does these very dark but wonderfully twisted, vivacious drawings. And I asked her to collaborate with me in interpreting the book. So in a way I never could have imagined. So we put this package together and we got a book deal. And then the issue of the film and TV rights came up. So I, of course, to solve an issue around that, said, I'll just start a publishing house. So came up with the name X Artist Books. I went to Keanu and I said, look, I'm going to do this thing, X Artist Books. I liked X because Keanu and I had done a book called Ode to Happiness, where the last page had an X. And I thought that had sort of become our signature when we did artist books together. And so much of my confidence of learning what's possible in terms of publishing came from working with Gerhard Steidl and doing the artist books that Keanu and I published. So had this idea for X Artist Books, and the next thing I knew, Jessica Fleischman, who was designing the Artist Prison, said, I have a secret book called High Winds. High Winds is a secret collaboration she and Sylvan Oswald had been working on for 3 years. And Keanu had a secret book called Zeus that he'd been, working on with Benoit Fougereau, the French photographer. And then we found that Ruth Esteves Gomez had a book called The Words of Others that was for her Pacific Standard Time show. And just to show you how I'm a publisher of 1 year. So to say I'm a publisher, it's like little tiny P, learning the business. But Ruth, the book about her show, so got a publishing deal with a wonderful publisher. The actual work on which her show was based, the artist book, she couldn't find a publisher for. Right? So we ended up as a first, we're 3 months old, and I'm trying to sound like I know what I'm talking about. Yes, I'll have that legal contract over as soon as we write it. No idea what I'm how many? No, I had no idea. So what I did see was this real, the fact that a historic show about an artist book would publish the book about the artist book, but not the real, you know what I mean? That just struck me that there was this real need to publish artist books that were complex and not just, I think a lot of what we think, I was just joking, a lot of artist books right now are I took 17 photos with my iPhone. And you're it's not, you can't, actually making a book and the architecture and thought behind it has to be so sophisticated for it to be a really great book project. And that was my goal with X Artist Books, was to find these projects. 3 of our projects ended up being performances. 3 of them. We Words of Others we did in here and in Miami. High Winds, I kind of love being the auntie. Sylvan, don't you think that High Wind should be an opera over a martini and him saying no, and then a week later saying, I applied for a grant and I won $10,000. And indeed, it's going to be some sort of performance. So it's that also, like, for me, the what does philanthropy means the love of humankind, but it's also giving permission. Like, I'm going to write you a little slip that says this should be an opera, and then you're going to run with it. And it's going to be, again, I think that we get so boxed in. So part of my practice for myself first, of course, self-care, hashtag, but is also to afford that to other people. And I love, how do we start? It's like, have you ever not done the dishes for a while? Okay. So I'm not like you. I do the dishes all the time. But I'm just kidding. Totally framed you on that one. But when there's a pile of dishes, you're like, where do I start? You just have to pull one knife. And I feel like we're in a bit of that situation in the world right now. We're a huge pile of dishes. It's like, where do you start? And you just have to start with a knife. One knife, and then I'll do a plate, and then and then I really want to get that fancy sudsy soap to make it funner to do the dishes, so it's an aromatherapy experience. I think that metaphor of doing the dishes is like part of ex-artist books, which is, if I can work with in 1 year 4 people and create, like, that the book isn't a book, it's a map for some kind of real world experience. With Benoit, it's like he's been nominated for 2 awards. All this crazy stuff has happened as a result of publishing a book. Exhibitions, that if I can do that, then I hope that someone else will be inspired to do something for 4 members of their community. And, again, it's really selfish. For me, spending time with Sylvan and understanding what High Winds is and understanding what it means to have written a play about moving to LA when you don't know anyone, but also moving to LA when you're still in the middle of your transition from being female to male, understanding what testosterone hot flashes are. I mean, none of these are my experience. So again, it's like, how do we continue to develop empathy by bringing closer in very egalitarian exchanges someone who's different. And my hope, again, with ex-artist books is that we can continue to find projects. And again, we can't, literally, we had a New York Times article over the weekend, and if I could tell you the number of valid proposals that came into the email box, hundreds and hundreds of very talented. We can't help every single person. Again, selling books is a business. You say all that stuff, but it shows me just the incredible beauty of that every person has. Like, how people are trying to turn their suffering and their experience into something. And I wish I could do it for everyone. But if every one of us who can does it for a few people, right? At some point over time, that will add up to getting the dishes done, at least for one night, and then the sink will be full again. But you know what I mean? Like, we have to do the dishes eventually.
I love that metaphor. So I want to know what you are most excited about now and what you see for the future. Any new projects on the horizon?
I think, like everyone here, the future is baffling. It's everything is changing. Everything we thought we understood about how things worked doesn't work that way anymore. I certainly can identify what I think some of the issues are that we as humans need. We need to, like, I remember learning about alcohol as a child and thinking, wow, it's so cool. This yeast community is like, sugar. Oh my God, I'm drowning in my pee. Like, that is what I think is happening. Sorry, that was my imitation of how wine is made. That hopefully will not become a meme. But you know what I mean? That idea of, like, that's what we're doing as humans, is like we're eating all the sugar and we're like drowning in our own pee, which is going to become wine for, whatever species survives this like next extinction, right? Sorry to be morbid, but it's a really, so I think the issues that as a world civilization, we have to understand how global difference and poverty and work. We have to begin to really address issues of racial and ethnic difference. We have to understand capitalism and how money systems privilege certain people. We have to understand massive brainwashing, because clearly that's going on. And we also have to figure out feminism, gender discrimination. We're going to become a post-gender world, at some point, which is super exciting to me. But we have to understand how to protect ourselves, too, for those of us who want to be part of. And what does that mean? Again, it's like that whole notion of self-care. So what am I excited about the future? Well, right now I'm really thrilled to be here because you inspire me to be more creative. You support me as an artist. And so it's like such an honor to be by your side. And I think it's that we have to understand how cumulative moments of real risk and interpersonal connection are going to get us. And one of the things I think about, I have had so much fear. It's like we're here talking as though like, oh yeah, and I did this and I did that and I did, like, that's the masculine story of my life. And so I want to tell you the feminine story, which is that I'm besotted by fear most of the time. So much anxiety, right? And sometimes I laugh about being 6'1" and white haired because I don't have a choice other than to stand out. Like, I can't hide. Someone will be like, can you get the tuna fish from the top shelf at the grocery store? And I'll be reminded again that I'm tall. So I feel this responsibility to the space that I hold, to the education I had, to the worldview that I was brought up in. And I want to make sure that I live up to that. That's a fear. But I have a lot of fear about being a narcissist. I have a fear about being I have so many fears about not being good enough, about this, about the, and so I think the future really is about growing in to this creative self and finding a way to grow the practice as a publisher, maybe into a bigger P from the little P. But as an artist, hoping to inspire other artists, and the painting for me is such a substantial part of what I do every day. And then through the philanthropy is to inspire other people to give back, to really think about how they are expecting arts to be supported in the future, and to really sort of plan around how are we going to support the young creative people. And honestly, for me, arts education is a huge thing that I want to work on, because I see that part of how our education system has failed the neediest members of our society is that they don't have arts education. So I'm not interested in everyone being an artist. Oh gosh. When I was younger and my sister told me she wanted to be an artist, I was like, no. But of course encouraged her. But it's like, we don't need a society of artists, but we do need a society of people who can problem solve, who can rotate a 3D object in their head, who can help themselves and who can help others. And I think that that's where the arts, in helping our imagination soar also, right? That it is like I had my last job before going to art school, and I swear this will be like, we're in this party central, but I had this weird job. I am not a Jewish person, but I had a temp job in New York where I was the assistant of the leader of the Jewish Theological Seminary of America, who is the leader of the conservative Jewish movement. I was Dr. Ismar Shorsh's assistant. And after the first day, where I realized that I had packed a ham sandwich and then thrown it away before going there. Like, I was like, I didn't know, one is naive and one is in a different culture. And I remember calling the temp agency and saying, I'm not Jewish. Is it okay? I'm so ignorant. I had to throw away my sandwich. And they said, no, they love you. So you got to stay. And my last day there, I was going to art school, and I had spent the summer, this is probably a terrible thing to say, but I'd spend the summer blessing different things and writing all these letters. But it also, Dr. Ismar Schorsch was in correspondence with a great person in the art world, Gershom Scholem. Anyway, that's a whole more academic tangent. But my last day, the head of the accounting department said, when you go to California, go to Vegas and never bet less than $10, never bet more than $10, but always bet $10. And I was like, okay, thanks. And then I went to my boss and he said, took my hand and he said, being an artist is being a religious leader. And I thought, I'm so young. What does that mean? But I think it really impacted me. What is that series of questions? Because people do look to you. Because you are in touch with something, again, whether it's the child part of oneself and other people, but that innocence, that second innocence, that becomes a kind of leadership. So my goal for the future is to never lose sight of that it seems to be the biggest struggle, is to keep that dedication to the why, the ethics of the why. And to spread, I've learned that you can spread that message through things, through presence, through books. But it's really to encourage people, I guess, back to love for themselves and for others. So,
do you all understand why I love her so much now? I want to open up the floor to any questions. Does anyone have a question for Alexandra?
Okay. Thank you so much for your truth. You're so open, and communication is so important between human beings. It's the most, without faking emotions or just giving yourself, to others. You talk a lot about love. So I would love to know what is your definition, because there's so many definitions about love. What's your personal? How do you see love? How do you put love in things? How do you, it's, I don't know.
I didn't think the questions could get harder than yours, and it turns out they can. I think love is such an interesting word because we use the same word to signify, you say I love you to your mom, you say I love you to your child, to your cat, I love this work of art, to your lover. So it's there's different, and it's interesting too, because when I think about the word love, there's always some parts of love are going really well. Oh, my relationship is on fire. I'm so in love, blah, 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 but I'm not getting along with my mom, right? Or I rear-ended someone and there was rage. So I see it all as this living volcanic thing. In the same way that the earth is alive and you just don't know what's going to explode or what's going to be verdant and green. I think love is a very living thing. And I think it's something that shifts as we grow and we mature and we are tested. And I even think those tests are part of love. That when a romance fails, or when you fall out with a friend, or you experience rage, I think all of those anger, it's something that all of that. So it's really, ultimately it comes back to a way of being. I think, this gets into my personal beliefs that our way of being in the world is pretty much neutral or content. And that love is this extraordinary thing on top of, if we can reach that inside ourselves, that love is this extra thing that bridges from a place. It's because often love is projection, right? That you can love someone and they don't love you back in the same way, or vice versa. We've all experienced being the object of someone else's admiration that we don't reciprocate. So there is that rare thing where that love bridge is the right distance for both people. And for me, that's perfection. Is that romantic love, or is it Ginna and I love you? And then we've learned and deepened our bond as friends and as professionals as well. But it's because we both have that same, our love bridge is 7 meters for both of us, right? So I think there has to be an exchange from both sides, that it can't just be the projection. So, and it's so complicated. I think the real question for me about love in the future, or what I think isn't love, is when we can label another human something that they're not. Like, that concerns me. You know, the political climate where someone is compared to an animal. I think that's problematic. I think when you look into the eyes of any human, I mean, that's the thing is, if you're stuck in an elevator with any person, you always will find something before you pass out from lack of oxygen, but there's always something in common. You know, even the most heinous person might have a mother or a daughter, or, you know, like, there might, so it's that moment of finding the commonality. I heard this amazing story about the woman at the Trader Joe's, where there was the gunman who went in, and she negotiated the whole hostage situation because she thought about, what can I find in common with him? And said, you know, my background is similar to yours. And she figured out how to calm him down enough to get him to surrender. And it's that moment I think we have to have it at a global level. And I think we're switching into an era where the distances physically between us as humans, because of the internet, and are smaller. So that someone living, you know, in a slum of Nairobi can be on Instagram with people here in LA. I think it's bringing into question, you know, what is the difference between these two humans? And so the people who keep reinforcing the difference, I think they're going to be outmoded. At least that's my prayer, right? And the similarity, and maybe maybe I am still naive in some ways, but this is my hope, is that we'll be able, really, you know, you can't love everyone, but that you can be in love, and you can be in love, and, you know, with just enough people. Again, it's like that publishing model, right? Like, if you can only love truly 4 people, then everyone is connected ultimately in that web. Any other questions?
That was a great answer.
So you came onto my radar when I came with a friend who lives in Santa Monica to your interior forest exhibit. And I've come to a few events of yours since then. And, you know, the reason I find myself gravitating back and following you on Instagram is because I'm not an artist in any way. My background is in science and math. I'm a biostatistician. But when I met you at Interior Forest, you kind of broke my stereotype of what an artist is like. You were smiling and you were laughing and you were so talkative, and I don't remember what you were wearing, but it was ruffly. And I've seen you at a few events since then, once in a bright red dress and you weren't angsty and you weren't dark and you weren't moody and you weren't unhappy, and that really resonated with me, right? It sort of made art accessible. And I also very much work in a male-dominated field and often get told that I can be sort of one of the guys, right? Which in a way I find offensive. So I'm wondering, you know, you mentioned that there's so many women in art school, yet they're not working artists later on, they're not gallery owners. Do you find that changing, and you can just be yourself more easily, fit into that world more easily? There's more variety of people in the professional art world now, and is it changing for the positive?
Another simple question. What is it about me? What's my favorite color? It's blue. Thank you for asking. I think that some things are getting better. You know, I think that there is an effort to have more representation in the art world. Still, it isn't enough. When you actually do the numbers, it's not enough people. It doesn't represent the 50% of the women in the art should be what's represented in museums and galleries. You know, I think that needs to be pushed for. But we don't have that in politics. We don't have that in any field. So it's not just an art world question. It's where I recognize that. In terms of how to be, I think that, you know, when I wrote The Artist Prison, some of the book signings were like, there are words in here I don't know what they mean. And I was like, well, that's good. I mean, I love being serious, and I love academic writing, and I love all of that. But I also think that I'm not, why be a robot? Like, I decided not to be an academic because I didn't want to be professorial, that I wanted to find the joy and be an enthusiast about things. And why would I repress who I am? It seemed to me that's not a good approach for anything in life. And it does put me at odds often with the idea of, but anyone, for me, it's interesting because anyone who comes and is like, oh, she's so nice and smiley and blah, blah, blah. Well, I will outsmart her. And I'm like, oh, okay, I'm really excited about this. Let's give this a shot. So the sense of like, you can't, but I think so many people are challenging that, like that you can be a public figure and you can, embrace your own style and not have to be a certain way, that you can be goofy and silly, that the intellect, in fact, that there isn't one way of being, because I think self-repression is a terrible way. I can't imagine not being authentic. I mean, if I worked for a company and I had to contractually make widgets and present myself as the maker of widgets, but that's not what I do. I do the opposite of that. I innovate. So I'm always, like I said, the fear comes from always being uncomfortable. And so in that, I can't possibly police a persona as well. My yearbook quote was, I'm sure it's not Oscar Wilde, but it was an Oscar Wilde quote that said, I never lie because I can't remember, or something like that. And I really identify still with that, because if you start telling lies about who you are, you have to be like, okay, well, now I'm this kind of person who believes these 12 things. I mean, it's complicated enough being a human being, but without having to tell stories of who one is. And again, like, I don't know anything else about the role of the artist than to upset that idea of what an artist is. I'm very interested in hospitality, in welcoming. I mean, so often art experiences for people are that they're made to not feel welcome, or that you walk into an art museum and you don't see anyone who looks like you, either in the gallery or in the artwork itself. So how are you going to relate to this experience? Because you feel excluded because of your gender, class, or race. So this idea of being welcoming, to me, I want to be I try to be the kind of person that I want to be around. Right? Like, I don't like being unwelcome, or the kind of teacher who is snobby. Like, I'm very much into excellence. I am not like, oh, everyone is brilliant. No. But I do think everyone is creative, but I'm not into elitism, and I'm not into replicating elitist structures that make actually people in power pretty lazy and make people think that they have to be like a cookie cutter version of something else. So again, like, I keep coming back to being, blonde and in this age. And so my sense is like to embrace difference, like that, to really embrace it and to see it as it has to be about not hiding, So I'm always so inspired by other leaders and whatever their fields are, who do things a little bit differently, who shave their heads, or who say, I'm going to do a project about turmeric. I mean, I don't know. It's like that people really come out and take a stance. I think it's so important that we don't follow certain modes. But I'd say that still the art world, there's so much fear in it about behavior and about value, and it's still policed very rigidly and invisibly about female representation. I mean, all these things. So I think it is important. I also realize that the risk I'm taking as a creator is a long-term game, right? That this might make me unpopular, maybe for 10 years, maybe for a year. The idea of being real, it's a risk. But I'd rather identify an audience through shared values than identify the audience and value my work according to them, right? So it's really important to me to establish the ethics and the value first, and then for the people who arrive to be the intended guests, right? I just think it's because You just never know. I mean, it's about the real connection.
We did a talk last month, and the theme was know yourself. That is the secret of success. So, I mean, I think that's what you're talking about, and that you are that brave person, being yourself through your work. And to me, that is success. So thank you for being that example for all of us here tonight. I want to mention that Alexandra does have books here for sale from X Artist Books, as well as some love prints. So if anyone feels inspired to take a little bit of love home with them tonight, you can do that. And just want to thank you all for being here. Thank you so much to Alexandra, to EP and LP, and to Megan for putting this together. Thank you.
Thank you.